Certainly is a blessing to be with you. Shane took some of my time. Not really, he took your time. I just want you to know. It's a blessing to be with you. I know when we get into these second sessions, that can be pretty challenging to keep our concentration, but you look like you're up to the task tonight. I appreciate so much your attention, your interest in these very important things. I remember very vividly walking into a living room of a couple that had worshiped with us there at Highway 65 in Conway, Arkansas for some time. And their son had declared atheism some time before this, and on a Sunday afternoon had taken his own life. They had asked that my wife Rachel and myself come to their home, and I've never seen a family, parents so broken in such an intense way. I have other memories as well. I remember standing in an area where, of course, those who are there to see folks and pray for them, at UAMS, University of Arkansas Medical Services in Little Rock. And a very faithful brother was fighting cancer. And they thought they might be able to perform a procedure that would greatly help him, but when they were in the middle of that procedure, the call came back very quickly, and as you know, oftentimes that's not good news. And it was inoperable. And holding the hand, and others holding the hand of his very faithful wife. I remember my wife Rachel having her second miscarriage and holding her as we'd experienced the loss of a child. And I know there are probably many couples here that have gone through that experience. And I'll never forget sitting by my mother's bedside as she was passing from this life into eternity. She had two terminal neurological diseases. She had been confined to her bed for some time, was able to have Bible studies with people up until 2 weeks before her passing. And I remember brethren singing songs and us praying, and I remember her drawing her last breath with full hope of her heavenly reward. And I'm sure if you and I were to sit down and start talking about people that we know and love that have suffered, maybe it was some natural disaster or some terrible sickness, or maybe it's not just physical, even emotionally, we know have suffered, and maybe you've suffered in that way. That when we get this question, why does God allow suffering? That can be a challenging question. And there's no need for us to pretend that it's not a challenging question. It is commonly brought to our attention by our atheist friends. And there are a lot of assumptions that our skeptical friends have about this. And often I think the problem is maybe we haven't even thought through it and how to keep that conversation going and how to defend the existence of God. And I will tell you at the very outset, there are many areas of human suffering and the glory of God and the goodness and love of God that are above my pay grade. And I recognize that. I'm not saying that I have all the answers. I certainly don't believe that. But I do know whatever has been sufficient for faith, God has revealed in His Word. There are some secret things, the Scripture says, that belong to God. But there are those things that are revealed. And we have to look at those things and think through these things. And so we all know it is true. Bad things happen to good people. Whether you're an atheist or an agnostic or a very committed believer and theist and Christian, the fact of human suffering remains. So it's not that the Christian says, well, this person may have human suffering, but this person won't. If we live long enough, we'll experience human suffering. But the question is, what context do we put that in? And that is the vital question. How do we interpret this? How do we process this? Because the atheist has to process it in an entirely different way than the Christian does. And along with that, we have to ask this question, and that is, from what we know, what is the proper or correct context for these things as we consider human suffering? And so I hope it will be beneficial to us just as believers at the very outset. But we're really going to dig in here. Now, there's two aspects of human suffering, and one of those aspects I'm not addressing tonight. There is an emotional aspect of human suffering. And there are some ways to approach that from the Scriptures that need to be approached. How should we respond to human suffering as Christians? And that may be one of the great questions for us as Christians. More than why, how do I respond? How should I respond? But that's not really what we're addressing tonight. What we are addressing is the atheistic argument against the existence of God based on the reality of human suffering. And I think what we'll find out, Lord willing, by the end of this lecture, if not before, is that the atheist actually has way more problems than the Christian does on this issue. But we need to be aware of where those problem areas exist so we can help share Christ with those individuals. So, is it true that suffering is a challenge to our faith? Absolutely. It's not an insurmountable challenge to our faith. It can even lead us to greater faith. I'm sure you'll recall the story of Job. We know more about the background of the story than Job was told in his experience. But in Job chapter 1, we have this dialogue between the Lord and Satan. I think one of the things that Job didn't fully realize about it was that it wasn't that God lacked confidence in Job and that's why he was suffering. It wasn't, as some of his friends interpreted this suffering, that God was angry with him or anything like that. It was actually God's confidence in Job that led to this. And of course, when we get to the divine speeches toward the end of Job, Job chapters 38 through 42, Job's been saying, I want to come before God. I want to, give my case and defend my case before God in His divine court. And then when he comes into the presence of God, not a whisper, because of the glory and the majesty of God. And one of the things about the book of Job, and this is for free, when we read those sections, it's so easy to see the majesty and the transcendence and the power of God. And well, we should see all those things. But we also need to see God's love, and sometimes that's not emphasized enough. He speaks of even the animal that is outside of Job's margin. He makes the point to Job that I've been caring for all of my creation, even those elements of my creation that you know nothing about. But suffering was a challenge. Perhaps you remember a man by the name of Asaph in the 73rd Psalm. And I think we could all relate to Asaph. He begins by saying, surely God is good to Israel, to those who have a clean heart. But he says, my feet almost slipped. I almost lost my faith altogether. Why? Because I looked around myself and I saw so many people doing wickedly and living evil lives, and they were prospering. And I saw those who were striving to be right with God and please God and glorify God, and they were suffering. Haven't you felt like that before? But later on he says the problem was I was looking at it purely from a human perspective. not putting God into the equation. He says, I was in verse 22 like a beast before you. But then, and the key, I think, to the entire psalm, verses 16 and 17. Remember in verse 16, he says, when I was trying to understand all of this, it was too painful for me, I think the King James says. But then, verse 17, he says, I went into the sanctuary of God, and then I understood their end. He looked beyond just the here and now. But if it was a challenge for Job, and it was a challenge for Asaph, and it was a challenge for some of the most faithful servants of God, it's okay to say it's a challenge. But again, it's not an insurmountable challenge. And, of course, Asaph maintained his faith in the Lord. So, suffering can be a challenge to our faith, and we shouldn't be ashamed to say that. Now, let's move ahead a little bit. Let me try to I want to present really the argument. And you've, in all probability, if you've talked to a friend that was questioning God or a skeptic or anybody like that, this has probably come up. Again, it's a very common question, and it's not really a scientific question. It's more of a philosophical question. But I do believe that the believer in God, the theist, has much stronger answers to this issue than the atheist does. So there was a man by the name of J.L. Mackie, and J.L. Mackie wrote a book in which he pretty much summarized this. He's certainly not the only philosopher or teacher that has tried to argue for this. He's trying to argue against the existence of God. Others have said it in some different ways, but this is fundamentally what it says. It says this. It says that, all right, to the Christian, you have God and you believe He's omnipotent. You believe He has all power. And you also believe that He is omnibenevolent. He's perfectly loving and gracious. And yet you understand, Mr. or Mrs. Christian, that there is suffering in the world. And the argument goes like this. It just says those things are incompatible. You cannot have a just and merciful and loving and gracious God and all-powerful God and I still have evil in existence in the world. And since we know evil is in existence, the argument is made there must not be any God. And so if I haven't thought about God very much, and if I haven't thought about the attributes of God very much, and if I haven't kind of worked through this in my mind, it's well and good to say, well, that's just above and beyond me. But what do you do when that's your spouse asking those questions, or your child asking those questions, or brother and sister in crisis, or your friend at work that you're trying to share the Lord with? We don't just shake our head and go the other direction. We engage that conversation. And so that's pretty much the argument. We're going to come back to this quite a bit, but I just want us to understand that's the argument. You've probably heard it before. I want you to know, though, that the argument itself on the surface sounds very strong, but underneath it, there are some real issues for the atheist. And so before you just say, whoo, that's a tough one, I'll give it to you. I still believe in God anyway. Before we do that, let's back up and really look into what this argument is saying. It's very interesting. The very things the atheist has to use to attack faith in God in these kinds of arguments are the very things that undermine their position. And there's several ideas that we're going to touch on. So often the thing that is said is that, well, for God, if God's all powerful and He's all loving and He tolerates evil, whether it's natural evil, catastrophic evil, human evil, whatever the case, then He would be immoral. He would be unjust. You'll hear the idea of justice. We're hearing that a lot in our society right now. He would be unjust to do that. In fact, some would even say He would be evil to do that. Well, let me ask this question. Where does the atheist ground or be able to legitimize using the concepts of justice, goodness, fairness, any of those notions? Evil, good, moral, immoral. How does the atheist, or what does the atheist ground that in if there is no God? And this particular question, and that's not that hard to remember. If I'm talking to an atheist friend and he starts talking about morality or goodness or that which is right or wrong, I at least need to ask, okay, wait a minute. I know why I talk about those things, because in my mind as a believer, it's grounded in my view and understanding of who God is and his attributes, okay? But what are you talking about? And we'll come to this, but are you just talking about what a particular given society has determined is, quote, moral, that is, what is good for them in their mind, but another society can come to a different decision? And how would that justify what you're saying? I want to share some quotations with you that I think will help you see exactly what I'm saying. This is actually a quotation from a man by the name of Alistair McGrath in his book, Mere Apologetics. And I think it shows that this argument, while it seems strong on the surface, is actually self-defeating. We just need to point out that it's self-defeating. Let me share with you what he says. He says, some atheists argue that the existence of suffering is evil and therefore is in itself adequate to disprove the existence of God. This is a curious argument, since closer examination shows that it is self-defeating. An argument from the existence of evil to non-existence of God depends on establishing that suffering is indeed evil. But this is not an empirical observation. It is a moral judgment. You get what he's saying? You're making a moral judgment here. He goes on to say suffering is natural. For it to be evil, a moral framework has to be presupposed. So going in, you have to base that on something. What is that something? You don't believe in God. But where does this framework come from? The argument requires the existence of an absolute moral framework if it is to work, yet the existence of such an absolute framework is itself widely seen as pointing to God's existence. You see what he's saying? He says, in the end, the non-existence of God seems to end up depending on God's existence. It's not the best argument. Yet if it's simply my personal perception that nature is evil, this has no relevance to the debate about God. It might simply say something about my naive and sentimental taste rather than about the deep structure of the universe. So the skeptic says, Bruce, to have a God that does this or does that would demand something evil. Where did you get your notion of evil? How did you decide that it was evil? How do you ground that other than that's just your idea? And maybe that's just your subjective notion. Or that's just our cultural notion. It's interesting to me when, and Frank Turek makes this point in his book called Stealing from God. And by the way, if you get a chance to get that book and read it, it's worthwhile. I disagree with Frank, and you would too, about some doctrinal matters about salvation, but as far as the discussion we're having, it's very good. And basically he says, look, the atheist has to plagiarize biblical concepts that only believers have a right to. I have a right to claim something about morality or about that which is evil and that which is good, but if your view of morality is whatever you decide it is or whatever a given culture decides it is, but somebody else in another culture can make a completely different decision, and that's their morality, and we've heard that a time or two, haven't we? You have your truth and I have my truth, then there is no truth. And then this foolishness about how illogical the Christian is, the believer is. Well, where did you get the idea of logic? It can't just be your idea. So there has to be, now I can talk about logic. I believe it's grounded in the nature of God and rationality and being reasonable. But if there is no God, It doesn't matter what our atheist friends appeal to. Logic, rationality, being reasonable, all of these things. Morality, good, evil, where did that come from? Just have your friend tell you where that notion came from. Where did those ideas come into existence? And if they are having to, wouldn't it say if somebody's having to plagiarize from the people they're attacking, that maybe their attack is not all that sound, reasonably? This is a man by the name of C.S. Lewis. I'm sure you've heard about him. C.S. Lewis had been an atheist. He actually reasoned himself into theism. He's written several books. The book, Mere Christianity, has this particular quotation, and he talks about what happened to him. So this very thing about the justice of God, he's talking about that. He says, and of course that raises a very big question. If a good God made the world, why has it gone wrong? And for many years, I simply refused to listen to the Christian answers to this question, because I kept on feeling whatever you say and however clever your arguments are, isn't it much simpler and easier to say that the world was not made by any intelligent power? Aren't all your arguments simply a complicated attempt to avoid the obvious? But then that threw me back into another difficulty. My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? He says, if the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be part of the show, find myself in such violent reaction against it? Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my fancies. And right now you're going, whoa, I'm getting dizzy. Okay. But if we really hone in on this, it's a powerful argument, and it's very helpful. And I don't have to have C.S. Lewis's mind to get what C.S. Lewis is saying. Everything gets unraveled when you start asking the right questions. He says, thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sins. One of my favorite quotes is right here. Listen to what he says, because we hear this a lot from our atheist friends. Well, you guys are just so illogical and antiquated and superstitious, and you're just not thinking very deeply, and you're too simple-minded. Listen to what Lewis says. Talking about how he had been thinking, he says, consequently, atheism turns out to be too simple. If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning. So let's think further about this idea of morality. So here's some good questions for us to think about and for us to be aware of. You know, sometimes you're having a conversation with somebody and you're using the same words, but it becomes pretty clear as you get a little deeper into this that even though you're using the same words, you have different definitions in mind. And so defining our terms in any conversation is always important. So when we talk about morality, what are we talking about? Is morality merely an arbitrary pattern of social behavior? So there's no objective sense of determining if something's good or evil. It's just what a particular given group of people think is in their best interest. It's more selfishness than anything else. Is it merely a conduct that benefits society? That's really, when our atheist friends talk about morality, guys, this is what they're talking about. They don't mean what you mean. That there's an objective sense of what's right and wrong, and it doesn't matter whether people believe it or not. It's independent of whether I believe it or not. If you believe in objective morals, that there's a right and a wrong. And we could come up with some really extreme cases where, to me, you just have to say, okay, that's right or that's wrong. And it doesn't matter whether we believe it or not. It's independent of us. It doesn't matter whether our culture thinks it or not or any other culture thinks it or not. If that's the case, there has to be God. So how can the atheist argue against the existence of God based on morality, justice, and goodness when he or she has nothing to ground or legitimize those ideas in? Objective morality, and this is important for us to know, is true whether one believes it or not. So moral truth exists independently of us, of our personal preferences. So objective morality is grounded in God. Now, if I need to listen to the atheist and try to understand where he's coming from, and I should, he needs to listen to me and understand where I'm coming from as a believer. And I think this becomes especially clear when we talk about these kinds of things. So, how should we understand morality? Non-believers will often ask some entrapping questions. And so we had a young lady several years ago. She was taking an intensive at the University of Central Arkansas, and she had to take a philosophy class. And so the particular philosophy professor that she had was an atheist. And so he really liked to give those who believed in God a hard way to go. So it wasn't uncommon for to get these questions. So they had a break in the middle of the class because it went so long for that day. And she called me and she said, "Hey, Mr. Bruce," she said, "this is what was said. I feel like something's wrong, but I don't know what it is." And here was the question. The question was, did God create morality? Now, as a Christian, we're tempted to say, well, because I believe God is creator, I'll go ahead and say yes. That would be the wrong answer. I would rather have discussions with our college students, our high school students, our junior high students, and our middle school students in a context where we can address these things before this gets leveled at them and they haven't even had time to think about it. And so I said, well, listen, that is an entrapping question. Because if you say God created morality, then that means there was a time when morality did not exist. And if God created morality and there was a time in which morality did not exist, then that would mean God wasn't moral. So it's an entrapping question. If you see what's going on. So here's the truth of the matter. In Romans 1:19 and 20, we're not going to read it tonight, but it's been read, and I think it makes this point very well. There has never been a time when morality did not exist. Let me explain what I'm saying. Morality is rooted and grounded in the divine attributes of God. His goodness, His mercy, His holiness, His righteousness. Was there ever a time when God was not righteous, when God was not good? No, these are His eternal attributes. There was never a time. As God is, so morality is, because morality is grounded in the existence of God. And she told me later when they came back and he had asked him to be thinking about this, and he called on her, and she said, well, as a Christian, I believe that as God is, morality is, because morality is rooted in the eternal attributes of God. He winked at her and said, good one. What I'm saying is, we cannot just say we're not going to talk about these scientific issues. We're not going to talk about these philosophical issues. We're going to have to talk about it. And we'll be benefited in our faith as a result of it. So did God create morality, or has it eternally existed? Well, it's eternally existed because of Him. Let's talk about why the atheist thinks we ought not murder other people. Okay. If you're an atheist and there's no God, what possibly would be your motive if you decided you didn't like somebody? Somebody says, well, no, wait a minute. Are you saying if I'm an atheist, that means I'm going to do the worst things? No, I'm not saying that at all. Are you saying that every atheist is immoral? I want you to hear me very clearly. No, I am not saying that at all. I know some who are atheists who from a societal standpoint we would be very friendly with. But here's what I want you to see. An atheist leads a moral life in spite of his atheism, not because of it. Now, Dawkins and others make this point. Several atheists have made this point. Their real argument as to why you don't go murder somebody else or hurt somebody else is because they might want to hurt you. And it goes back to this idea of evolution and the selfish gene. So it's a rather selfish thing. I don't want you to hurt me, so I'm not going to hurt you. I'll be nice to you, so you will be nice to me. You see, from the standpoint of faith in Christ, the Christian has an entirely different viewpoint of others. And by the way, this is another issue which has already been touched on tonight. But Christianity has a very high view of humanity. Evolution does not, and atheism does not. It cannot. As a Christian, and this is emphasized in the book of Genesis, all the way through the New Testament, all the way into James, when he talks about how we treat each other, we understand that we each have been created in the image of God. We bear the divine image in that sense. And so, for me to hurt you is to hurt one who's been made by God in his own image. Jesus talks about that in Matthew chapter 25. You'll remember that. If you did it to one of the least of these, you did it to me. That cannot be justified for atheism. God-centered morality is logical, and it is the most reasonable explanation. But here's Richard Dawkins. Here's what Richard Dawkins thinks about us. He says, there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good. Wait a minute. We started out hearing about God being evil or good or moral or just. Richard Dawkins says, on his theory, there is no evil and there is no good. Now, which one is it? When I'm arguing against God, he's evil, but I don't really think there is any such thing as evil. He says nothing but pointless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being. And so we've made this point. This is objective morality. It's not based on social acceptance. So here's some questions. What is the basis of objective moral values according to atheism? What is the basis of human value on atheism? Why should we do the right thing and not the wrong thing if there is such a thing? And what is the basis of moral responsibility? Now, I can answer that as a Christian, but what would the atheist say? This is Brother Dan King in that book that Shane mentioned a little bit earlier. And this is a syllogism, and I usually don't like syllogisms very much. But this is a good one, and it's simple. And this is what we're getting to. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist, okay? That's just a fact of the matter. Premise 2, objective moral values and duties do exist. They just do. Therefore, God exists. So, let's talk about this morality issue and why it matters on naturalism versus supernaturalism, which is the existence of God. And this is real simple. Naturalism. First of all, and you might think about this, how would you have let's think through this for a minute. How do you have merely a natural explanation of the natural world? I can have something outside of the natural order cause the natural order to be in existence. I can deal with that as a Christian because I have a supernatural God explanation. So if you take the atheists back far enough, they become very frustrated because they have no answer for that. And they're not going to get an answer for that as long as they embrace atheism. So naturalism denies an absolute and intrinsic moral sense of values. A supernatural explanation, that is a spiritual explanation of God creating the world, we have an affirmation of absolute morality. Listen, there is no third option. If you have a third option, you let me know all about it. I have tried to think of a third option. I can't think of one. There's only two options here. We either have objective morals and we have the existence of God, or we don't have any sense of objective morals and duties, and we don't have God. So I want to go back to where we began. So there's some real flaws in all of this. But I want to talk about for a moment God's goodness and human suffering. Now there's something embedded besides all the appeal to justice and all of that I want you to look at. And that is that, remember J.L. Mackie that I quoted at the beginning and what he said about a loving God and powerful God and all of that? The assumption, we give it too easily, brethren. The assumption is that God did not have a morally justifiable reason and does not have a morally justifiable reason to allow suffering to exist or evil to exist. Do I think God is pleased with the evil that exists? No. Do I think he holds his nose and tolerates it in his permissive will for greater purposes that he has? Yes. Do I think that his heart breaks over the sinful choices that humanity makes in which he hurts himself and blasphemes his creator? Absolutely. But do we know, if we're going to look at the story and the way that it's presented as a Christian, that God has a great purpose in mind? Yes. And listen, if you're going to criticize the story, you've got to at least know the story. I cannot tell you how many times, if you'll read carefully, from Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and a whole host of them, I know you don't believe there was a Garden of Eden. I know you don't believe there's a God that created. But if you're going to criticize the belief system of somebody else, at least know what the belief system is. And I'll demonstrate why that matters in just a moment. But if we can show that God had a morally justifiable reason to allow suffering for a temporary period of time in his mind, then the whole proposition the atheist is given implodes. It's non-existent. So the whole thing is based on this. Was it morally unjustifiable for God to allow suffering? If it is, the atheist has a point. But if we can see that that's not the case at all, that he had a morally justifiable reason to allow suffering. Remember, we're dealing with the intellectual side of this tonight. Then he does not have an argument. So let's look at what the biblical account and narrative and story is. And that account involves at least four important things. First of all, what we find out is that God did not create the world in the condition that it is now. When you go back to Genesis, that when you look at the creation, it was good. God said it was good. Maybe some of you who've had children for a while remember when maybe you and your spouse were dating and you were really serious and you were talking about getting married and having a family and having children and why you wanted to have kids. And some of you are looking at me like, I have no idea why we wanted to have kids in retrospect. But anyway, you decided to have a family. Why did you decide to have children? Did you think, wow, this will be awesome? We'll have somebody to vacuum the carpet and take out the trash, and how's that working out for you? No, you wanted to have a family because you understand, first of all, your children are in the image of God, and you wanted to have relationship. We talk a lot about the attributes of God, but sometimes there's an important attribute of God that we don't look at, and that is relationality. Even in the Godhead, the Father, Son, and Spirit have relationship. And one of the characteristics we have that we share with God is this sense of fellowship and relationship. And God not only created us so we could have fellowship with him, but so that he could have fellowship with us. That's Genesis 1 and then 2. But then in Genesis 3, sin takes place. Somebody says, Bruce, why did God not just make man so he couldn't sin? Because if he can't have free will, if he has no freedom of will, we can't have love. And love's his motive. He wants relationship and fellowship. And so, yes, does he know he's running a risk from some perspective? Because it may well mean that there's going to be rejection of him by the majority of humanity, yes. But he loves you that much. He loved us that much. So that even when man sinned, and there were consequences of this, sickness, you read about all this in Genesis 3:17 through 19. Now again, if you're going to criticize the story, you got to know the story. Genesis chapter 3 speaks of the consequences, and we live in a broken world. That's true. And we see the consequences of sin. But God could not have a loving relationship with us if there's not free will. Now, that is the story. It's because He loved us that we have what He has offered us, and we have to deal with the consequences. C.S. Lewis says, of course, God knew what would happen if they used their freedom the wrong way. Apparently, He thought it worth the risk. If God thinks this state of war in the universe a price worth paying for free will, then we may take it. It is worth paying. If you think it is hard for you to observe it and for me to observe it, how do you think it feels to an all-holy God to observe it? So He must love us an awful lot. And we know He does because He gave His only begotten Son. Now, I want to address the attributes of God. There's two main attributes I want you to think about with me that come to play in this. And often this is an area where we grant we don't need to be granting. First of all, there's the power of God. And we probably have all heard it. Probably most of us think at a time when we may have said it. Okay? So we think of God being all-powerful. The atheist says you can't have an all-powerful God and there still be evil. Well, he's defining God's omnipotence as though God has have you ever heard somebody say, well, God has the power to do anything? Well, if you grant that, you might have some trouble with the atheist, but the fact is that's not what the Bible teaches. He has the power, and hear what I'm about to say, He has the power to do anything that is in harmony with His will and His nature. There are some things God will not do because it's not in harmony with His purpose. God cannot lie. Why? It would violate His holiness. He says God is light, in Him is no darkness at all. God is faithful to His promise. He doesn't go back on His promise. Hebrews 6, the immutability of His counsel. And so we need to understand that when we're looking at God's power, it's not power to do anything, but power to do anything that is in harmony with His will and nature. One of the aspects of His will is His permissive will, which means God in His long-suffering patience with us allows things to be as they are so that we can invite the lost to come to Him. It won't be that way forever. But that's the way it is right now. And so we need to understand power. But let's talk about goodness. A lot of the times the way we think of God's goodness is God does what I want Him to do, which basically would mean that I'm God or that I can manipulate God. No. Goodness, the idea of God's goodness may mean He permits suffering. 2 Corinthians 12, the thorn in the flesh. Remember, my grace is sufficient for you. Goodness means God puts my spiritual interests before anything else. That doesn't mean we don't pray for food or pray for physical things. But it does mean that God's goodness is way beyond what we think we might want in a moment. And our unbelieving friends certainly struggle with that. C.S. Lewis again says, we want in fact, not to insult any grandparents by the way, we want in fact not so much a father in heaven as a grandfather in heaven whose plan for the universe was simply that it might be said at the end of each day, a good time was had by all. I should very much like to live in a universe which was governed on such lines, but since, now hear what Lewis says, please listen. But since it is abundantly clear that I don't, and since I have reason to believe nevertheless that God is love, I conclude that my conception of love needs correction. You're listening very well tonight. Instead of saying, well, if God doesn't do what I want him to do in the time I want him to do it, in the way I want him to do it, then there can't be a God, which is a pretty arrogant thing to say. What Lewis is saying, and this is so valuable, he's saying, maybe the problem isn't God, it's me. Maybe I have a superficial and a shallow view of God's power and goodness and love. And what suffering demands that I do is go deeper into my understanding of God. And the deeper I go, the more hope I have. So no, we cannot meet the skeptic with a superficial view of God. But we can meet the skeptic in love and grace and mercy with a deeper understanding of who our God is based on his teaching. Okay, we got to do this. So turn back to your Old Testament. We're going to shift gears, but we're not really shifting. We need to deal with this regarding suffering. And I want you to turn back to Deuteronomy, actually. At this point, our atheist friends tend to say, oh, yeah, Bruce, but what about all that stuff in the Old Testament? What about the God of the Old Testament? I mean, that looks pretty rough. And so we're talking about suffering, but that's suffering God brought on people. And what about the Canaanites? If you listen to any formal debates with atheists, I promise you what we're about to talk about will come up. There's some really good material out there I would encourage you to get a hold of that's out there from a variety of sources that offer some very good biblical explanations. But basically it says, okay, this has to show that there's no God because this would be an evil God. Sometimes I feel like we are trying to answer this by denying what the text says, and there's no need to do that. There can be no denial. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 7, that God did bring physical judgment on the Canaanites. And as we look at Deuteronomy chapter 7, he's very clear about that. He mentions the Hittites and the Girgashites and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Texasites. He mentions everybody. All these peoples in this particular area, and it says, and when the Lord your God delivers them before you and you defeat them, then you shall utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them and show no favor to them. Furthermore, you shall not intermarry with them. You shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor shall you make their daughters for your sons or offer them for your sons, for they will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods. And then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will quickly destroy you. He says, I want you to tear down all these idols and the Asherim, and I want you to be a holy people. Come to Deuteronomy chapter 20. This is a vital text in what we're talking about. So we're not denying that God did mention the need for judgment. And here's what I want you to see. In Deuteronomy chapter 20, if you'll look with me, and we need to read careful here. In verse 9, when the officers have finished speaking to the people, they shall appoint commanders of armies at the head of the people, and when you approach a city to fight against it, you shall offer terms of peace. So there was an opportunity for those particular people. If it agrees to make peace with you and opens to you, then all the people who are found in it shall become your forced labor and shall serve you. So they would become servants. However, if it does not make peace with you, but makes war against you, you shall besiege it. When the Lord your God gives it into your hand, you shall strike all the men in it with the edge of the sword. Only the women and the children and the animals and all that is in the city, all its spoil, you shall take as booty for yourself, and you shall use the spoil of your enemies, which the Lord your God has given you. Thus you shall do to all the cities that are very far from you, which are not of the cities of the nations nearby. They're not a threat to you, but this is your protocol, okay? But stay with me. Verse 16, though, only in the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, they'd be right there in proximity, you shall not leave alive anything that breathes. Now, there are some that have come along, some quote Bible scholars to say, well, he doesn't really mean what he says. He means what he says. Now, depending on the location of those peoples, that determine different protocols, but he means what he says. Verse 17, but you shall utterly destroy them, the Hittite and the Amorite and the Canaanite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite, as the Lord your God has commanded you. I'm not going to stand up here and insult your intelligence by saying that's not what he told them to do. That is what he told them to do. But he goes on to say, so they will not teach you to do all these detestable things. And you can read the rest of that. So, the atheist says, therefore there can't be a God. That's just the most terrible thing I can imagine. All right, let's see. Remember when we started out, guess what the atheist has to, what kind of judgment an atheist has to make on this kind of story? Moral value judgment. Where did he get that moral value judgment? He didn't get it from atheism. So that won't work. Did God have reasons? You know, I'll read you in a minute a quote. Dawkins, Richard Dawkins says, that this, by the way, was not genocide. This was not genocide. This was not racism. It was nothing of the sort. You know, God didn't wake up one day and say, you know, today would be a good day to kill some Canaanites. I think that's what we'll do today. No, do you know how long he had been patient with those Canaanites? Who had ambushed his people? 400 years, according to Genesis chapter 15, verses 13 through 16. He said when the time was full, he would bring judgment. All that time, you know what they had the opportunity to do for 400 years? Repent. Now, let's talk about these, you know, often the skeptics, they present the Canaanites like they were the most upstanding people. You just want them to be your neighbors, just the kind of people you'd want to have a peace alliance with. Well, let's talk about them for a minute. They were violent. They were murderous. They were murdering their own children. Something God said never entered his mind. They were taking just think about this for a minute, their smallest of children, putting them in the hands of an idol, and they were burned alive. There was all kinds of sinfulness going on here. But you know, when we hear about this, we don't hear about that. When we hear this argument, that's not brought up. Child sacrifice is not brought up. Not one time that I've ever heard, except from somebody who's defending the Lord. So was it just arbitrary? No, they were an extremely immoral, sexually deviant, abusive, cruel, vicious people. According to Leviticus 18, they had been disobedient to God. They were involved in ritual prostitution and child sacrifices. And yet when the skeptic presents this, he tries to put God into that very category. Richard Dawkins says that the destruction of the Canaanites was an act of ethnic cleansing, false, in which bloodthirsty massacres were carried out with xenophobic relish. Xenophobic means they were afraid of strangers. This is another case where if Mr. Dawkins would read the Bible a little bit more, at least he could fine-tune his arguments, except for the fact that he hates God. But Genesis 12 says it's through the Jewish people that all nations of the earth would be blessed. We know that God used the Jewish people to bring judgment, but he also used pagans and Gentiles to bring judgment on the Jewish people. The Israelites had laws regarding the foreigner coming in and caring for them. They had civil law, which offered legal protections for strangers. All of this is in the book, by the way. Ruth was a Moabitess. She ends up in the Messianic lineage. Rahab was someone who was clearly out of the community of Israel. She ends up being cared for by Israel. Now here's the one that's very interesting to me. And I want you to remember this one. So here the atheist says, I can't believe in God because look at all the evil in the world, and if he would just intervene in the world, then maybe I could believe in God, but I can't believe in a God who wouldn't intervene and bring judgment on evil. You with me on that one? That's been the argument we hear all the time. Okay, I'm going to walk over here now. But then we come over here and we get to Deuteronomy, and this is the argument we hear. Well, I just can't believe in a God that would have done this kind of thing. Let me get this right. So you're not going to believe in God because he doesn't intervene, but you're also not going to believe in God when he does intervene. He's only got two options. Either he intervenes or he doesn't, and in either case, you're going to try to use it to attack God. Is the problem really God bringing judgment on wicked people? Or is it that you're afraid he'll bring judgment on you because you don't want to submit to him? Is God committing murder? It's a question I've gotten before. No, he's not. He can't be. He created the life in the first place. See, the reason it's murder for us is because it's a life we didn't create. Have you ever heard anybody say, well, that fella's trying to play God? Doesn't that imply God has a right to be God? And by the way, those children would have been protected by the hand of God, and he has a right to simply transition from the physical sphere to the spiritual sphere. Those children would be in the arms of the Lord. There was a apologist, I guess you would say, defending the nature of God. On this point, a woman called in to the radio program, and she said, I just can't believe that you would believe in a God that would do this sort of thing regarding these children. And I thought the host was rather insightful. He said, oh, you have a problem with these children and this judgment and God taking care of them in that way. Are you pro-life or pro-choice? Let's chew on that for a little bit. She hung up. So it's okay for you to murder innocent life you didn't create, but it's not all right for God to transition these children in judgment on those who had their supervision, who were wicked, and take care of them in eternity. Those arguments just don't hold up. We're going to end here, and your suffering will come to an end. Okay. So we're going to take care of where we began. Okay. So the skeptic argument that we've talked about some flaws in it and some problems in it, but it really does backfire. But I would say uniquely, this is my personal conviction, uniquely with those who are Christians. To really defend theism. I know there are others who believe in God, but to truly defend theism, you need to embrace Jesus Christ as the Son of God and as your Savior. And let me show you why. So, here's the skeptic's argument. If God is all good, he would defeat evil. If God is all powerful, he could defeat evil. But evil's not yet defeated. Hence, there's no God. That's the argument, right? here's the problem. Because evil is not yet defeated does not mean it never will be defeated. In fact, let's read the biblical story again. There's this thing called the resurrection of Jesus and our future resurrection. And there's going to be a super reversal of death and all the consequences of sin. That's the hope of the Christian. So, here's how it backfires. If God is all good, he would defeat evil. If God is all powerful, he could defeat evil. Therefore, God will defeat evil. God will defeat evil in the future. And I want you to hear this, is presently, right now, working against evil. Through the cross, through the resurrection, through his people. Just because he's not on the timeline that some want him to be on, doesn't mean he's not working actively in his people, and that he one day will not destroy this world, come back in judgment through Jesus, resurrect the dead, and bring our hope to a final reality. You've listened so well tonight. Thank you so much. So, we began with this argument that seems compelling, but when I start asking questions like, where did that idea of justice and goodness and morality and evil and all that, where does all that come from? That's an issue. Secondly, just know some things from Genesis, some things about the cross, and some things about what the Bible says about the ending, and that's your answer. Why does God allow suffering? He has a greater purpose in mind for all of us. It may be that you're not a Christian tonight. Will you come? Will you obey the Lord? Will you come into his kingdom? Will you embrace the faith that will lead you to eternal life? Repenting of your sins, confessing Jesus as Lord and King and as the Son of God, and being baptized for the forgiveness of your sins. Come now, together we stand and we sing.